Hello and welcome to the Just and Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder that everything that we do with Just and Center is listener supported. So we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor. Go to justandcenter.org, go to our donate page, and help us out there. Now, last time I wanted to get through Adorno and critical theory and Marcuse, all of this within a single hour, and we were getting close to the hour, and I realized this is a pretty big shift in the talk here, and I just thought, I don't want to rush it within 10 minutes or something like that, so I'm doing a separate program to do a part 2 of this, and so we're going to continue on from what we were at last time discussing Adorno. So if you really want to follow along with this and you've just clicked on this video or this podcast and haven't listened to the previous one, this is directly coming after what I just talked about. So you're kind of in the middle of a talk. I'm recording this the same day. I just had to divide it up. Okay, so we are talking about critical theory. So let's define... Well, we're going to define actually in the next slide exactly what critical theory is. But what we're talking about, just as a reminder, is the Frankfurt School. And the Frankfurt School is a group of thinkers, largely aestheticians, philosophers, some psychologists, some interested more in sociology, people of all different fields that have come together under a broadly Marxist banner to create what is sometimes called a theory of everything. And in that, they are trying to solve what they see as the deficiencies in the West, and particularly with regard to capitalism. All right, so we're going to talk about critical theory and its relationship to Marx. So what does critical theory grab onto that comes from Marx? And then we're going to ask, well, how exactly do we define critical theory? When you start reading on critical theory, the first thing that you'll probably notice as you start getting into the subject, if you have any desire to read on critical theory, is that nobody seems to be able to define it. And oftentimes books will include definitions that really aren't definitions. And critical theory sometimes is much better described by what it is not than what it is. And some authors will tell you that straight up and say, we don't really know what critical theory is, but we can tell you what it's not. Because we're really talking about a very diverse group of thinkers. And thinkers that have some broadly similar convictions that capitalism is bad for the West, convictions that things need to change and that they can be part of that change somehow. And they all do different things with it. Okay, so, but they are all broadly under the banner of what we label as critical theory. So in order to define critical theory, which is, as I said, kind of the most impossible thing to do, we're going to start with where it is that they derive ideas from Marx, and then we'll talk about how it is that they define it themselves, because we have Marcuse gives a kind of definition, at least, of what critical theory is. So first, critical theory relies on Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, and this is central. And I've defined this a couple different times in this series, but I'll just quickly define it again for you. Because I know the more you repeat things, the more you tends to stick with you. All right, so commodity fetishism. This is the idea that we take commodities, things that are produced via human labor. Largely in Marx's time, we're talking about things that are produced in factories with mass production. So we take objects that are really commodities, that are objects, and we fetishize them, which means that we make them into subjects themselves. We treat them as if they have some kind of inherent intrinsic value in themselves. We essentially treat them as if they are persons. We give them the value of personal subjects, even though they're really just objects. They're commodities. They don't have any real value in themselves. We talked about how Marx, in Marx's perspective, the value in a commodity really is the value of what the worker himself is doing, or herself. So the worker is creating value through their work. So what you should be paying for is the work of the one producing the object, not some kind of value inherent in the object itself. But commodity fetishism treats it as if it has this inherent value in and of itself. It's some kind of transcendental thing. Okay. And for the critical theorists, they're going to say that Marx's insights must now be reapplied in our situation, in what they call late capitalism. And you see that in the even in the phrase late capitalism, there is a belief that capitalism in its original form is kind of coming to an end. This is late. That was early capitalism. This is late capitalism, not middle capitalism, which means that, yeah, it changes, but it's going to come to an end. That's the hope, is that capitalism is going to die. And so now we've hit late stage capitalism. And so late stage capitalism, as they're talking about it, has a lot of significant differences from what was capitalism in the 19th century. Because now people are living a lot more comfortably than they were. The middle class has risen exponentially at this point. There have been enacted a number of labor laws to, thankfully and rightly, to stop the abuse that's happening, especially with like child labor laws and, various mandatory requirements of vacations and breaks for workers. And I don't know the specifics of each country and what those regulations were at the time, but those things start to develop, and those things are continually developed to try to stop kind of the abuses of the labor force. So things have shifted pretty significantly at that time. So they're saying that now our circumstances are very different. So what we need to do is reevaluate Marx. So we need to reapply his insights. So they're saying that, Marx wrote, and Marx wasn't right about everything. They're not going to say Marx was correct about all things, because certainly he predicted things that didn't happen. That's why they reject his scientific socialism, as Marx called it. So they're saying that we need to now reapply them in the context of late stage capitalism, and that application is going to create something rather different than what we had in Marx himself. So then we have the influence, not just of Marx, but of Lukach. We did that whole talk on Lukach. If you haven't watched, that helps to lay a lot of the groundwork here. So for Lukach is going to be the first one to give a really thorough and extensive approach to Marxism that applies to what is called late stage capitalism and how it affects culture as a whole. So what Lukach says is that the capitalist economy has now overtaken all areas of society. And so when we're speaking about Marxism, we're speaking about capitalism, we cannot just talk about the narrow field of economics, because now he says capitalism controls every single area of our life. So it's total. Its control over our lives is total, which means if you want to overthrow capitalism, what you have to overthrow is total. It's the complete culture and ideas we have in our day, in our age in the Western world. So what we're going to see is the development of these totalizing theories that try to say, well, capitalism has affected or destroyed everything in their view, and now we have to find ways that we can totally overthrow that. And so he says every area of culture is guilty of commodity fetishism. So we fetishize commodities. We make objects into valuable things or into persons in every single thing that we do in life. It's not just when we're buying something made in a factory. It's everything that we do. So that is really important, because this leads to critical theory's desire to be a theory of everything. Because the totalizing aspect of Lukach now is adopted by the critical theorists. Okay, then we have the idea of reification, also coming from Lukach. Essentially says that in the process of reification, while we fetishize objects, they become treated as subjects or as persons. Now we treat ourselves, or we are treated in the capitalist process and in the machine, we are essentially treated as objects. We're part of just a machine. We are part of a labor force that just has a step in the process, just like a machine will have a step in a process. And so we are then treated as objects. And we then start to see ourselves as objects. So it affects our own self-consciousness and our own self-evaluation, which is why then you need the intelligentsia here to now bring forth the class consciousness of the people who have really been reified. They don't understand who they really are in society, and they need the Marxist intellectuals to tell them what the real problems are so that they can come to some kind of real self-understanding. One of the questions that is asked now by the critical theorists, and Lukach as well, is why does suffering exist in a technological society? And so since Marx's time, we have seen just this rapid development of technologies. The early 20th century, it's wild the amount of shifts that we have. We have radio to TV to, trains to automobiles, and in terms of weapons we've developed technologically a lot. So why does suffering still exist even though we have so many great technologies? You'd think that the more we create technologies, the more we innovate, the more those innovations would be used to help those who are suffering. And I would say, of course, the reality is that they have helped significantly. And the conditions of the 20th century got much better in terms of the everyday life of people, besides the Great Depression and the 2 world wars. But I mean, if we're talking about just personal lives in terms of how technology helps us, it has helped in significant ways. But what they're going to say is that technological societies still have suffering, not because of sin in the human heart. The problem's never going to be just in the human heart, because we have to look for the other as being the object of the problems in the world. So they're going to say that the reason suffering exists is not because of personal sin that affects everyone, but instead it's those wealthy people at the top. And what they're doing is they're hoarding wealth and resources so that even though technology is developed and we're creating new things to make life easier, it's all being hoarded by this select few. And this is similar rhetoric to what you heard at, say, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and the top 1% who, and of course there is an exorbitant amount of wealth in terms of the top 1%, and I'm not going to touch on the validity, the ethical issues surrounding that or not. That's not really my point here, but Lukach is saying that is the reason why suffering exists in the world, is the select few at the top hoarding all of the resources. Also, another idea that we see being brought about by the critical theorists, and we saw this in talk of aesthetics and music already some, is that capitalism is driven by a mass production of art. So they're saying that capitalism is not just, say, about factory work, it's not just about economic inequalities or exploitation, if you want to use that term, which is the more classical term in Marxism, but it's also driven by the art that we produce, by the media, by movies and music, and even just the fact that we just print artworks and ship them out to have nice kind of chintzy things to stick on your walls to make things look pretty. Marcuse helps us with a definition of critical theory in using these 3 C's. And this, I think, is as helpful a definition as anything. And like I said, I've read a bunch of books and articles trying to define critical theory, and there really is no good way to define it. This is the best definition I've found, because it is kind of undefinable. So the 3 C's, this is really the goal of critical theory, is these 3 things. So first, it's to comprehend society. And this means that they want to have a comprehensive grasp of what is happening in society, why society is the way it is. And you can do that by means of grabbing onto, say, one problem, like what they see as the problem in capitalism, and say that creates the essence of society. And here's how it affects everything in society. Okay, so that's why we have that capitalism now is not just about economics, but it's about art, it's about the human essence, it's about our relationship to nature, our relationship to ourselves, our self-understanding, what is real, what's not real. I mean, everything is defined by capitalism. So comprehend society first. That's the first thing. Second, criticize society. And so it is a critical enterprise. That's the point. That's why it's called critical theory. So the goal is to comprehensively offer criticisms of Western civilization. And Marcuse does explicitly say Western civilization. He's probably the most destructive and radical of those who are part of the Frankfurt school. So they want to criticize society. And third, they want to construct alternatives to society. And this is utopian. You see the drive. There's utopian language in Adorno, and there's a utopian language in Marcuse. They do it differently. And Benjamin has a utopian vision as well. But again, that's a little more religious in nature, so it's different. But they're all saying we want to understand comprehensively. That's the question. Can you really comprehensively understand society? I mean, it's quite a goal. And you want to comprehensively critique society. Remember, everything to them is total. Part of their Hegelianism, they totalize everything. So they're saying that you need to destroy the total and totally restore something brand new. You're not doing this in a piece-by-piece way, right? So if you look, for example, at a conservative approach to, say, abuses in factories in the 19th century, There are plenty of conservatives that speak out as well about the abuses of, child labor and those kind of things. But the more conservative approach is not going to take this totalizing view. So they're not going to say we have to destroy everything and it has to be radical revolution. But instead you say things like, okay, well, how can we address these issues really in a way that is not just destroying society, but like actually address the particular issues? Because everything is not just total. You can actually deal with issue by issue things. So you can say, okay, well, let's deal with child labor laws. Let's have, mandatory vacations. Let's have, minimum wage laws. And yeah, you can debate the validity of minimum wage laws and whatever. But my point is that there are ways to critique what's going wrong in the world with what you see is wrong without saying we need to totally destroy everything and start over. And that's what these kind of revolutionary attitudes do that are largely driven by Marxists, or those who are at least to some degree influenced by Marx. So they want to construct now alternatives to society. They really want to construct alternative societies. What are these utopian societies? All right, so now I want to talk, as we've now actually given a somewhat definition of critical theory. We went a ways before we went to the definition because, I thought about starting with the definition, but then the difficulty is you kind of have to build up to the definition, because unless you understand everything they're doing, you can't really understand the definition that well. So I know it's a little bit of an odd place to go. We did this whole program last time on a critical theorist. We finally just defined critical theory in the second part, but that's how it is. So as we talked about, part of this critique of everything that we find in critical theory is a critique of culture. And so they are going beyond critique of economy to now critiquing culture. And again, I'm going to say, as I said with Lukach, this is where the term cultural Marxism comes from, in that Marxism is applied to cultural critique. And Marxism, in the Frankfurt School, is not just a system of economics, but it also is a tool that is used to critique culture and to also talk about how to create a new culture and a better culture. So I think a cultural Marxism is actually quite an apt term to refer to this approach to dealing with culture. Anyway, I know the term doesn't really matter, so you don't have to use it. But I'm just saying it's not just a conspiracy theory. Like, they are dealing with Marxism and how it relates to culture, and they are using Marxist critique to critique culture and to propose alternatives. So here is what we have in Adorno. And Adorno does this in a unique way. There are criticisms of culture that show up in the other figures, but they deal with them very differently. And they also offer very different views on what a good purpose of art is going to be. What is the function of art? What is good art? What is bad art? All right, so essentially, the culture industry says that there is this industry in especially the United States. We see that, as I talked about Adorno, he comes to the United States, he spends time in New York City and then LA. And so when he's in LA, he sees what's going on in Hollywood and is kind of horrified by what's going on in Hollywood and says, basically, this is not that much different from the kind of authoritarianism that we find in Nazi Germany. It's just, you're just pushing this kind of mindless obedience by means of mass media. All right, so mass media, and let me make a clarification on the term. So Horkheimer and Adorno write about this together, and when Horkheimer and Adorno write an earlier draft of the text, they use the term mass media. Now, eventually, when this volume is published, they do get rid of the term mass media because, so let me just explain, I'm fine using the term mass media. So I'm just going to explain this so you understand why they didn't prefer to use the term. Because what they didn't want to get across then was the idea that it was media that was created by the masses. Instead, it's a media that is created to control the masses. Because as good Marxists, they want to support the proletariat. And if it's media that's created by the proletariat, which are the masses, they would want to say that's good, right? They want to say like, oh, that would be good art. So they decide to change the name to the culture industry from mass media. But mass media is the first phrase they use, and when I'm using it, I'm referring to the media as it is used to control the masses for the masses, not something that comes out of the masses themselves. Okay, so just know that when I'm using this term. So this mass media creates a mindless hegemony. Hegemony meaning that it makes everyone the same. It makes their views of the world the same. It makes their view of what is good and what is bad the same. And essentially, it makes people mindless because it stops creativity and it makes people just consumers, just like capitalism does, but consumers of media content. So media is another side of capitalism, essentially. So it's just like the kind of mindless work that happens in a factory where you're not doing anything thoughtful. You're not thinking a project through. You're just kind of one kind of cog in the machine. That's exactly what mass media is doing to you. It is mindless entertainment that is just there to kind of stimulate the senses and not actually give you anything valuable to do or to think about. And as capitalism does, the culture industry creates needs which don't actually exist. Right? You need to see the next movie. You need to do the next thing because mass media thrives on money. And this is all true. This is why I say that Adorno has actually some very good insights because he's right about this. He's right about a lot of this. I don't think his Marxism is the answer to this, but he is giving a valid critique of mass media. And I think the culture industry, in terms of there being this mindlessness in the movies and films and TV shows that we watch, which is really just there for the sake of the profit of the company, that's all very true. So he's right about this. And I've made plenty of critiques, and many conservatives have also made kind of similar critiques in some ways, even though the answers will be a little different. Read Roger Scruton's work on modern culture. He has some similar critiques to what Adorno is going to criticize as well. Though, again, the answers are going to be a little different, of course, because coming from a different perspective of values. But so that mass media creates needs which don't actually exist and then meet them with its products. So, do you need... And I have Marvel movies here. It's like, do you need as many Marvel movies as we have had and continue to have? Well, not really, but what does every Marvel movie do? It has an end scene after the credits that advertises the next movie. I mean, every Marvel movie is just an advertisement for the next movie. And increasingly, TV series it's just one advertisement for the next TV series or the next season of that series, which is a need you didn't know you had, but you need it now because now you know that there's something coming after. And you always also feel like you're going to get some kind of satisfaction from the next season, and you don't because the next season just prepares you for another season. So it really just prepares you to buy more and doesn't actually fulfill anything at all. And I think this is all very true. I'm saying I'm not a fan of Marvel movies. Okay, then it makes people simply passive receivers of what the culture industry creates. So they're no longer being creative. They're now not spending their time on things that are worthwhile, but now they are spending their time just receiving whatever the culture industry creates. And so this means that thinking and freedom are stifled because we're not sitting with our free time now. Right? If you're working at a mindless job all day and you come home and what you do at home is, turn on the TV, or this time it would be really going to the movie theater, but turn on the TV and watch a show that is, The Bachelor or whatever the heck show you watch for like 2 hours in each episode. And, then you eat dinner in front of the TV and then you go to bed. Well, what is your life? You're doing meaningless things all day. There's no real meaning in your work. There's no real meaning in the media that you consume. So you're just a consumer, part of a machine. That's what with the average person's life in the United States. And it is a critique largely of the United States, though not exclusively, but come on, I mean, it makes sense with our culture. So now we're not spending time reading books. We're not spending time being creative, producing art. We're just receiving mindless, valueless art. And so high art or beautiful art, good art, is no longer valued. And here's a critique of Adorno. Well, see, a lot of the left likes to critique Adorno here, because Adorno really does privilege the high arts. He loves classical music. He loves operas. He speaks about them very, very highly. He has essays, as I mentioned, on Bach and Beethoven. He loves the high arts. And that's really his passion more than anything else. And so he wants to, in some sense, value the inherited Western arts and criticize what the masses like, and he's really lifting up what the elite like. So it's just interesting. It's interesting. And it's something that he's been criticized a lot on by the left, which you can kind of understand why that's the case. But he does give reasons why some art is better than others. And he's not saying it's better because it appeals to the wealthy. He believes this kind of art should be accessible to all people. But this art challenges you. It brings you beyond yourself into something more universal than yourself. There's a little bit of Kant's view of art that shows up here. That there's the particularity brings you into something universal in a disinterested kind of way. But he also, as a Marxist, he's going to say there's something beyond art in just encountering beauty, because a beauty is not something objective. Okay, so he's not going to say, as I would, as a Christian thinker would, when you encounter beauty, you are encountering God's beauty as reflected in the art. And this is part of our being created in the divine image and with creative capacities, that we can create art that mirror what God does, and God's glory and beauty shines through good and beautiful pieces of art or music. He's not going there, so he's not saying it's objective. But what he does say is that beautiful art, or good art, what he's going to really call good art, is that which challenges you. Because for Adorno, there needs to be this increasing challenges to the status quo that lift us or open us up to revolutionary ideas. What Adorno's not going to say, and here's where he differs from some others. So Walter Benjamin is going to say this. Adorno is not going to say that our art needs to be, we need to basically take mass media and then stick in mass media a bunch of radical propaganda to force our views on the masses. He doesn't think that's good at all. He says, we need to freely come to these ideas of revolution, in his view. And we do that through art that challenges us, but not through shoving it in our faces and forcing it on us, because that's just what the culture industry does. And he's saying you don't want to do the same thing, which is very interesting, because that is how a lot of radicals have viewed it in more recent years. So you have a couple different views on how this works, and then you have a Walter Benjamin who says, no, we can actually grab mass media and we can stick our views into mass media, and then it will come down to the people. Gramsci does this to an extent as well, but we'll deal with him separately. So Benjamin does say that, but Adorno's saying no, he doesn't want that to be the case. There are a lot of different views on art that show up here and what the value of art is. Some would say that high arts or good art shows you that there's something more to existence than your day-to-day life in your capitalist society. Therefore, it shows you there's something good to fight for, and that will kind of lead you on to revolution. But there is this ultimate political end. So Adorno kind of does have the political end, but it's not strictly political. So he's not saying that's all there is to it, or that it needs to be in-your-face political media. He's saying mass media is just bad as a whole. Okay, he's not saying we'll stick our ideas in mass media. He's just saying get rid of mass media. Yeah, and that's why I say here I think he's got some good insights. Okay, so he says economic success drives art. So art should be, if it's good, it should be driven by freedom. It should be driven by what is beautiful, what you decide you want to make. Adorno's critical of art through patronage or church art, because really man needed to be freed to be able to make art. So the Enlightenment does bring about this great freedom. Now artists can make whatever they want to, and you see this all throughout the 19th century, but now that's all been stifled by mass media and the culture industry. And I do tend to actually think that's kind of right, because as mass media grows, I don't think there's been a lot of great art in the last 60 years. And I think that there's a reason for that. But he would criticize, the art that's used in churches and patronage. And obviously I would not go there at all. Because I think art, ultimately, beautiful art is there to reflect the glory of God. I don't think that's the only purpose of art, by the way. I know that some try to say that the only purpose of art is the reflection of divine beauty. And I think there's also there is a role in art to show evil for what it is as well. I mean, Scripture certainly does that. And it can do it in an artistic or beautiful way. Now, I don't mean that all art should just be ugliness and destruction and meaninglessness, which it tends to be in the contemporary art scene. But something like Picasso's Guernica, I think it's a powerful message. And that kind of message really can only come across through something that is a bit shocking. So not shocking for the sake of just to shock, but there is a place, I think, for displaying the realities of sin in the world through art as well. But that would be maybe a question on theories of art, which I want to deal with at some point if anybody cares. Okay, and here is Adorno's best insight. Walt Disney, he says, is the most dangerous American of all time. Yeah, okay. I'm kind of down with that. Honestly, I don't know. I may agree with that, and maybe for different reasons, but I think this is largely true. I think you can see what happened with the Star Wars franchise, and yeah, I'm a big Star Wars fan, as many of you know, and if you look at what the Star Wars franchise was before Disney, well, it was the vision of one man, right? George Lucas. And George Lucas he's a student of, classical mythology of various cultures, and tried to, show forth these various archetypes in his storytelling. And it had value and meaning for him. There are a lot of themes that repeat. He decided to make 6 films and didn't want to make any more. Because that was the story that he wanted to tell. And it's quite an epic story, and I love the films. You can criticize the dialogue of the prequels, but that's fine. But they are stories of passion. They are stories of a man's vision. You can disagree with the vision or think he didn't do a good job, but that's what it is. And it doesn't take long to watch Disney Star Wars to recognize the difference between a art that is driven by a thoughtful vision of an individual who cares and desires to make something that is his story, which he was always very clear. I'm making my story that I want to make regardless of what anybody thinks. And he did. Like, a lot of people didn't like the prequels, but the guy just did what he felt was right for the story. And Disney, which says, we can pump out as much as possible and make lots and lots of money, so let's copy the movie that was successful and add new characters to it, and they can all just be replicas of old characters. And you have the Star Wars sequels. I mean, it's a disaster. And I think that's a great picture of this, of what the culture industry really does. So I don't think that he's totally wrong here. I think there's some very helpful insights. Well, let's talk a little bit then about Herbert Marcuse, because we've been dealing with Adorno mostly in critical theory, and I do want to really talk about Marcuse a little bit. In many ways, Marcuse is the most radical and dangerous of the Frankfurt school. Okay, so his years are 1898 through 1979, so he has a very long career. He lives a long time. He's very active throughout his life, and he has many public appearances. Look up photos and videos of him. You can see him all over the place. Now, Horkheimer and Adorno become more pessimistic about the reality of revolution as they get older. People generally get pessimistic as they get older. Not always, but, read late Luther's writings. He gets pretty darn angry and pessimistic. And they're not thinking that there's going to be some kind of total radical change, and people start to criticize them a lot on that front. Which is a little odd also, because Adorno becomes a kind of hero to some of these student movements in the 60s, and you'd think that hope would give him hope. He doesn't really have that much of it, for whatever reason. So Marcuse is the one that is the most hopeful for revolution throughout his life. And he always holds on to this hope for some kind of real Marxist revolution. He has a Freudian revision of Marxian ideology, which they all do. So Freud plays a really significant role in all of this. Something I actually didn't touch on, and I wanted to, but it just was a matter of trying to trim down things I could summarize for you. But Adorno does this very famous psychological study on the characteristics of people who have authoritarian personalities. And there is this survey that's given to try to judge whether somebody would be authoritarian in their personality type. And he believed that maybe we could find out what authoritarian personality types are, and once figuring that out, we could get that out of people before they get too old and become authoritarian. If you actually read the questionnaire, it's interesting. But if you read the questionnaire, it largely appears, especially with the answers as well, and their conclusions regarding it, it largely appears that more populist conservatives are authoritarians and liberals are the least authoritarian. So they're kind of like liberals are the ones who don't really have a threat of authoritarianism, which I just don't think is true. I mean, I think looking at the communist revolutions is not true. I think authoritarianism is can show up on all sides of all sorts of things and is bad no matter what. But so it's been criticized, right? The study is very famous, but it's been criticized, and I think rightly so. But it shows you that Adorno has this interest in psychology. It shows you kind of how these fields start to overlap. So Marcuse, like the others, he also has a Freudian revision of Marxian ideology, and he wants to ask the question, well, why? What's the reason why the revolution hasn't happened? And he wants to get to the psychological answer for that, because as Marx expected, these proletarian revolutions are going to happen. As I said, the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and the Russians are like, everybody else is going to have these revolutions, and all of Europe is going to be totally changed, and it doesn't happen. Why? Why doesn't it happen? And so he tries to find a psychological explanation. He was coming with the assumption, of course, that revolution would be good for the people. That's the assumption. So if it's good for the people, why would they not do that which is good for them? Well, he tries to delve into some of the psychology. And he says, essentially, what's happened is that the working class, the proletariat, they are given just enough to stop them from revolting, right? They are given, they're not given a lot, right? They don't have everything they need, but they're given just enough that they won't actually revolt, that they won't try to fundamentally overthrow the system. So they're just happy enough. And that the bourgeoisie gives the working class just enough that they're kind of pacified, right? It pacifies them. And because of that, because of this pacification that happens, the working class actually has no idea that they're exploited. They're not aware at all of their exploitation. So what does this mean? It's somebody's role now to make them aware of the exploitation. It is somebody's role to let them know that they are indeed being exploited. So who is it that takes the role of making them aware that they are being exploited? Well, the intellectuals. It's him and others that are like him. Those are the ones that let people know that they are indeed being exploited. All right. So Marcuse sees the hope for this kind of revolution in what he calls the revolutionary consciousness. And so when he starts seeing these student movements in the 1960s, he sees these as hopeful, that this socialist revolution that he's hoping for would indeed happen. So he says that the proletariat has this revolutionary consciousness that lies, underneath the actual beliefs of each individual. We talked about this before, how in Lukach, so I'm getting these thinkers confused in my head. It's starting to keep them all straight sometimes. But in Lukach, we saw that he argues that you can't actually find the view of the proletariat by asking people who are part of that class. And he says, instead, we have to understand this underlying kind of consciousness of their class consciousness of the proletariat. And you don't do that just by asking individuals. So now what Marcuse is going to kind of to add to that is we see these little pieces of it. We see these kind of spurts of the revolutionary consciousness or the class consciousness kind of showing up. And these little pieces of that class consciousness seem to be showing up more and more. And so as we see these student movements growing, this is evidence that a bigger revolution is indeed coming. And so he talks about some of these movements, one being the civil rights movement, another being women's rights and feminist movements, and then student protests, largely protests, against wars. I have an image here of the protest, many protests against the Vietnam War. So we think about the revolutionary, hippie movements and the hopes for these kind of utopian ideas and hippie communes that show up in the 1960s, largely with young people. And as we've seen, these ideas do tend to be most prominent among young people, which is where most of these individuals get their revolutionary ideas when they're rather young. But something else that Marcuse argues is that he is the one to say, we've got to redefine the proletariat. And so when we're talking about proletariat in the 19th century, we're speaking about people who really are in, horrific working conditions. in factory work, working long hours with no breaks. There's no safety, precautions at all. There are no regulations. You have children that are working long hours. There's a ridiculous amount of abuse, low wages, all of these kind of things. But now we're saying the proletariat's not just that group, but also the proletariat is also the white-collar worker. And so he says the average middle-class American is actually part of the exploited class. So the person, who is able to, like I'm looking out my window at like my neighborhood. It's like very middle-class neighborhood. So the people that are able to own their own homes, pay for the food that they need on the table. They got a pretty good selection of food. If they go to the grocery store, they can afford to like go out to eat somewhat regularly. They can, afford to have cable TV or whatever. Not that anyone has cable anymore. So now it would be like, Netflix and whatever other streaming services they want and access to the internet. But those kind of people, they're now the proletariat. It's been totally redefined. But what's the definition? Well, we saw that it's changed largely because they're still grabbing onto Marx's definition. There's a shift in how the class is understood, in that now people that have more money and are in white-collar jobs are part of the proletariat, but it hasn't changed in terms of the fundamental essence of what makes the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, so that the proletariat are those who do not control the means of production. So even if you're the white-collar worker, you have a decent job, you make a decent amount of money, you've been to college, all those kind of things, you still can be in a position where you're still a cog in the machine, where you don't have true freedom. You're not controlling the means of production. And this class, he says, this middle class that we see becoming part of the proletariat, they have what he calls a surplus consciousness, so that their consciousness is not just the material production that they're involved in, or whatever white-collar work they're involved in. But they have this consciousness that goes beyond that, and they have mental energy that goes beyond the mass media that they're consuming and beyond their work. And this surplus consciousness is now what can be used and what is to be really manipulated by revolutionaries to show that they really need to become involved in whatever kind of revolutionary work they should be involved in. So this idea that there is this surplus consciousness that then starts showing up in these protests or these various student movements. Now, Marcuse has a plan. He has a plan to essentially bring about what he wants to do. And that is that he wants to stir up this revolutionary consciousness. So he says, well, how exactly do we stir up this revolutionary consciousness? Because we have the surplus consciousness, we have the proletarian consciousness, and we see little pictures of it, but how can we increase that, right? So how can we make sure that people start thinking in this way? How can we inform people that they really are oppressed, even though they don't know it? They don't know they're being exploited. But it's there in their class. We've got to let them know. Well, he really sees the best hope for that through academic institutions. So he sees that it should be the role of academic institutions to instill Marxist ideas in their students. Because if academic institutions can instill these ideas into their students, the professor has this kind of prophetic calling. Right? The professor almost becomes the pastor of this Marxist secular religion. That he can tell people the reality of their spiritual condition, right? They don't know their spiritual condition, but he can tell them, and he can tell them how to find redemption, which is join the revolution, right? So the professor now, the academic, has the goal of awakening class consciousness, which already is there, right? It's already there underlying what's going on. It just needs to be awakened. So the idea is that there would be an intentional attempt to have Marxist academics in Western institutions in order to awaken class consciousness in young people and make them radical revolutionaries. So that, it maybe sounds like a conspiracy theory that people have or something, and I know it's kind of portrayed by the left as if it is a conspiracy theory, but I mean, he's clear about this. Marcuse is very clear about this. These are ideas that Marxists have had. They've said here, the academic institutions, we control the academy, and if we control the academy, we control what the young people think, and we make them into radicals. He defines the goal. This is a quote here. He says, the goal is to cause, quote, a radical transformation of all basic values of Western civilization, end quote. Now, just to be clear, that quote does not come from anything critical. I found that quote in the Routledge Handbook of Marxism and Post-Marxism on page 160. Okay, so it's not an anti-Marxist source that has this quote. They're citing this positively as that's, maybe not positively, but just this is what his view is. This is what he says. And that text refers to him as the most radical of the Frankfurt School, which is true. He is definitely the most radical. But Marcuse's idea is a radical transformation of all basic values of Western civilization. So this is what he wants, is an overthrow of Western civilization. He wants Western civilization to be destroyed and completely remade. So we have everything, again, as the totality. The hope for that totalization of overthrow and revolution and starting over is already there within classes. It just needs to be awakened, and they use that class consciousness now to be active, overthrow the West, and start new. In his, he's got an article called Marxism and the New Humanity. And here he makes some pretty bold claims. But essentially he says that we need to create a completely totally different humanity. I mean, we have really a secularized Marxist doctrine of regeneration. That what we need, according to Marcuse, is a new humanity. Because all of our values, the way that we function socially, everything about us as people. Remember, we're societally determined. So there's no human soul that can be regenerated. Everything's societally determined. So if we're a product of society, that means that if we change society, we change ourselves. And we need to fight for a complete recreation and renewal of humanity. So you see how radical and extreme the program is when you get to someone like Marcuse. Now, Adorno's not nearly as extreme. Horkheimer's not nearly as extreme. And they lose, as I said, they kind of lose hope in revolution. But when you get to people like Marcuse, they are arguing for a complete overthrow of Western civilization. And so it's not really a conspiracy when someone says that the Marxists want to overthrow Western civilization. Well, some of these people do want to overthrow Western. That's the goal. And the question is, how much do people listen to Marcuse, and how much of an influence is he? And he's a pretty significant influence. I mean, you can look up just scholarly articles if you have access to JSTOR or something like that and see how much he's cited. He's cited a significant amount, and he does have a very, very broad influence. And Gramsci's going to have some similar ideas. Well, okay, I think I'm done with this part now, and it hasn't quite been an hour here. I'm a little short, but I decided to split this in two just because I knew it was going to get close to 2 hours. It wasn't going to be enough time to do an hour and 10 minutes. I don't want this to go too much longer than that. So maybe 2 slightly shorter videos, but I think you'll survive. So hopefully you find this helpful. I know that these are like figures that a lot of people don't know, and it's very different from what I usually talk about, but I'm hoping that this really does help to educate you and show you where we are as a society today. I'm trying to be as fair as possible to these figures because I have plenty of critique, but I want to read, and I've been reading far more sources that are favorable towards these figures and works of these figures than I have been reading critical sources, and that's what I generally try to do. So I'm trying to be as fair as I possibly can. And still giving you some critiques, but I want to be honest with the source material. So anyway, hope you found this helpful. Let me know, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. God bless.